We're going to be covering depth of field in this session. Now, I know you've already had depth of field in theory, but this is going to be using depth of field in its practical application. Now, for these assignments, we're going to have our camera in the A setting. So for my Nikon, that's the A setting right there. But for your Canon users, you're going to be in the AV setting. And the display is going to show an A in the upper left-hand corner right there. When you rotate the control wheel, you're going to see that the f-stop right here will change. And as that changes, the shutter speed, the corresponding shutter speed, will also change. But you choose the f-stop and the camera chooses the shutter speed. Remember, I'll be using the terms aperture and f-stop interchangeably. They mean the same thing. Well, if the camera has so many f-stop aperture choices, why would I choose one over the other? What difference does it make? Well, the smaller aperture, that's the higher f number, like f22, it provides more depth of field. That means that there's more in focus from the front to the back of the image. A larger aperture provides less depth of field, and that means that only a certain select part of the photo is going to be in focus. So what's the preferred setting? Do you want to use less depth of field or more? That depends completely on the subject matter. The general rule is that when you want to separate the subject from the background, like in a portrait or a close-up of an object, you want less depth of field. That's accomplished with a long lens and a low f number like f2.8 or 3.5 or 4. When you want a lot of depth of field, like a landscape or a group shot with many rows of people to get in focus, you'll want a lot of depth of field. You get that with a high f number, like f16 or f22. For wildlife, sports, and portraits, you'll want to use a very long lens and a fairly low aperture number for the maximum magnification and less depth of field, like this shot with a 300mm lens. These images taken by wildlife photographers demonstrate how dramatic the long lens and the short depth of field combination can be. That's the standard for most wildlife and sports photographers. In this landscape shot, we're using the wide lens setting and pointing the camera down slightly to raise the horizon. Our f-stop is f16 for the maximum depth of field. Now, I know this can be confusing at first, but practicing these settings will get you to understand the mechanics of the camera and how you can control the image. In 3 or 4 shooting sessions, you'll get a pretty good handle on the results from these controls. By the end of this class, you'll be very good at this. Our assignment for this session is very ambitious. We will be using manual focus for this assignment. You will set your camera in the aperture priority mode. That's the A mode on Nikon and the AV mode for Canon users. This will allow you to select the aperture, and the camera will set the shutter speed for the best exposure. Begin by setting up 2 objects like pine cones. Make sure both objects have the same light on them. We don't want one object in bright light and the other one in shadow. They must be lit the same. Position them as I have in this photo. They're about 5 feet apart. Notice the position of the closest pine cone in the frame. It's large and in the left-hand portion of the frame. This is important because the first 4 shots of this assignment must have that pine cone or whatever object you choose at the same size and in the same position for all those 4 shots. The second object is in the right-hand portion of the frame. This position is also critical because this object position also remains constant for these shots. In shot 1, you'll set your zoom lens at the widest focal length. which will be 18 millimeters for most of you with an 18 millimeter to 55 millimeter kit lens. This is called the widest lens setting. Move closer to the front object if you have to make it big, like I show in my photo. Focus on the closest object. Set your aperture at the smallest aperture you have. This will be f/22 for most of you. Hold the camera steady because the exposure will be long. Take this shot. In shot 2, you'll keep the composition exactly the same. Change to the largest aperture you have. That will be the lowest f number, like 3.5 for most of you. Now remember, the largest aperture is represented by the smallest f number. It's very confusing, I know. So in review for shot 2, you're going to change to the largest aperture you have, and that's going to be the lowest f number, like 3.5. Take the shot. Now in shot 3 and shot 4, you're going to set your camera on the longest focal length you have on your zoom lens. And what I mean by this is the most telephoto setting you have. That's the setting that brings things in closer, makes objects bigger. If you're using an 18 to 55 millimeter lens, you'll need to zoom in to 55 millimeters. The front object will get bigger, so you'll have to move back to make it the same size as it was in shots 1 and 2. The back object will appear larger. Don't worry about that. Just make sure the front object is in the same position and it's the same size as shots 1 and 2. Focus on the front object, but we're going to change the f-stop to the smallest aperture. That will be f/22 for most of you. Take the shot. In shot 4, we're going to keep the composition identical. Set your camera on the largest aperture, probably 3.5 for most of you, and take the shot. Now shots 5, 6, and 7 can be taken using the same objects or 2 people, as I've done. In shot 5, you're going to be using the widest aperture, which is the lowest f number, and you're going to focus on the front object and take your shot. Your image will have the front object in focus and the back object will be out of focus. In shot 6, you'll continue using the same wide aperture, and that's probably f/3.5 for most of you, but this time you're going to focus on the back object. Take the shot. Your image will have the front object out of focus and the rear object in focus. In shot 7, you're going to focus on the closest object and you're going to change to the smallest aperture, which is the highest f number, probably f/22 for most of you. Take the shot. If you've done this setup correctly, both the front object and the back object will be in relative focus. Now in shot 8, this is the final shot for this challenging assignment. In shot 8, you will use your wide angle setting, which is probably 18 millimeters on your zoom lens. Position 2 elements so they look like they're touching each other. This photo requires you to use the smallest aperture, which will be f/22 for most of you, and it will give you the maximum depth of field. You must focus on the object in the foreground and then position the object in the background properly to make the illusion look convincing. You will find that shot 8 can be done easier and to better effect by using your cell phone, and this is advisable actually for this assignment. This is because cell phones have very wide angle lenses and a very small aperture, so they're perfect for this kind of shot. This is called false perspective or false illusion. For this submission, you will have a total of 8 photos on 5 screens. Put the 5 screens into a PowerPoint slideshow and make sure each shot is labeled with the exposure you used. There's a lot of steps to this assignment. Upload the PowerPoint slideshow to me through Canvas. This assignment is worth 35 points. That's 5 points for every correct screen and an extra 5 points for labeling them correctly. Good luck with this. It's challenging.